Let's wait for the speaker, right? Yeah, perhaps we can just start. This is session 4 before the keynote by Yiping. And we don't schedule the afternoon tea, so we'll continue with two sessions. So this session is again talking about the international dimension of the digitalization technology, but from a more policy oriented analysis. Right, well, just started. Yeah. Brent Williams is a legal expert on the multilateral trading system, especially WTO, and advising government and institution on these on the legal measures. And John Edward is associate with the Lowy Institute. John is very prolific writing, and he served as a board member of a Reserve Bank of Australia before, and in recent years also quite actively participating in the kind of thing. So we thank you for that, John. And lastly, we have students from Griffith University, quite few people, and again focus more on the quantitative side about the about the impact of digitalization of both the production and the distribution of goods and services, and but specifically focus on the impact on the export efficiency. So which is again welcome back. So this is the second time you participated in a time update. So let's start from a break. Okay. That's great.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Michelle for inviting me today. First point, don't think you need to write anything down. Just put these slides on the williamstradeboard.com website and look them up later. What got me started on this choice of topic was that when the WTO released its settled text on a draft agreement on e-commerce, there were two things that were completely left out. They couldn't agree on, and one was any rules on data localization, and the other one was any rules on international movement of data. So I decided I'd investigate that a little bit. Just from sort of first principles, you can think of various domestic policy concerns which might affect the way governments behave relating to movement of data or data localization. They might be concerned with censorship or privacy or consumer protection or protecting public morals or protecting telecommunications networks or national security. And in order to address those public purposes, they might adopt data localization rules or restrictions on international movement of data as one of their tools in the toolkit. But that can cause some tensions with achieving the economic objectives that you can get by facilitating international transactions for sale of goods and sales of services, and facilitating international business people from being able to choose what's their best way of doing business and where to store their data. I just skip that one. Early in the 21st century, there was a bit of a contrast between the way the US was dealing with this and the way the EU was dealing with it. The US was very much emphasising free movement of data, and that was reflected in some of the USA's early bilateral agreements containing chapters on e-commerce. The EU, in contrast, was emphasising data protection and protection of privacy, including protection of your privacy from the government, against the government, or any government. And the EU had concerns that the US government could force disclosure of data to the US government. And so the US and the EU had a negotiation about that, and they finally, in 2000, came up with some safe harbour rules which would allow for transfer of personal data from the EU to the US. That turned out to be just version 1, and there were a few subsequent versions of that agreement over the years. The US position was reflected when 12 countries negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And although the Trans-Pacific Partnership never came into existence, this clause that they negotiated, basically you can see that it's replicated in subsequent trade agreements that have come into existence. So in the TPP, the position there was that you do allow cross-border transfer of information by electronic means, and in 14.13.2 that you will not require a covered person to use computing facilities in that party's territory as a condition of doing business. But for both of those rules, they had an exception for measures that were to achieve a legitimate public policy objective, provided that the measure, it was essentially kind of a least trade restrictive test. A, the measure is not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on trade, and B, does not impose restrictions on the use or location of computing facilities greater than required to achieve the objective. But as you know, the US announced it was not going to ratify the TPP, so the TPP never came into force. On the other side, in the EU, the development of the law in the EU is all about developing principles for protecting privacy. And the earlier developments were superseded in 2016 by the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And that data protection regulation allowed cross-border transfer of data to non-EU countries only if the other country provided a, quote, adequate level of protection. And that meant they would assess whether or not the protection of data in the other country was comparable to the protection under the European Union General Data Protection Regulation. And in order to assess that, the European Commission would assess the privacy law in the other country to which the data was going to go. And it would assess whether the privacy law protections are just as good as the privacy protections that you'd get in the EU. The second thing that the EU would assess in determining whether you've got adequate level of protection was whether the recipient's country's laws on surveillance by public authorities placed sufficient constraints or limitations on the ability of the public authorities to access people's personal data. They then had a fallback position. If you could not establish that you had an adequate level of protection, then the companies themselves could put a contractual obligation in their contract using some standard pre-approved clauses about how they were going to treat the data. And then there was another fallback position for multinational corporations transferring data within the one corporation if they adopted some binding corporate rules that the EU had prescribed. Now, when you look at that structure, you'll see that China adopted something very similar to this structure later, with a significant difference. That is, China does change its rules eventually to allow cross-border treatment only if the other country provides an adequate level of protection, and it does provide for the government to assess whether there's an adequate level of protection. And it does provide that if you can't establish a level of protection, then you can fall back to the clauses in the actual contracts. However, in China, adequate level of protection is not about privacy or limitations on government surveillance of individuals. In China, it's about national security. So same words, completely different concept. 2017, the WTO members started discussing e-commerce as a result of Australia, Japan and Singapore putting forward that proposal. There were 71 members participating, but China initially did not participate. The next year, the TPP morphed into the CPTPP, and the exact same clause that was in the TPP gets carried forward into the CPTPP. So you've got the same rules that you shouldn't have prohibitions on local storage, and you shouldn't have prohibitions on transboundary movement of data, and the same exceptions for legitimate policy objectives. China's not in that, of course. 2017 is the year when some other bits and pieces of cybersecurity law were basically superseded by a more comprehensive framework of laws for electronic commerce, the 2017 Cyber Security Law. And you can see it's quite different to the US and EU. On data localization, the Chinese law required data collected or produced in China to be stored in China. And on international movement of data, it provided that persons wishing to transfer data outside of China had to obtain a security clearance under measures formulated by the state cybersecurity department and other departments. And there were penalties for that, including losing your whole business, having to shut down. There's a limitation in these laws. They only applied to critical information operators, which was just limited sectors, telecoms, transport, finance. It didn't apply to the whole economy. Then the WTO negotiations went to the next stage and actually formally decided to negotiate a text of an agreement. And straight away, China came in, changed its mind, and decided it should participate in the development of the rules. The US was the leading proposer that the text should include a prohibition on data localization rules and a general freedom of movement of data across transnational borders. And you see that US approach reflected in the US, Mexico, Canada agreement even more strictly in that they didn't have a legitimate public policy objective in that agreement relating to the localization rules. After the CPTPP came into force, 3 countries entered into another agreement on e-commerce, expanding a few more aspects of e-commerce and lifting the provisions out of the CPTPP into a separate agreement, which also has these rules about free movement across borders and prohibiting data localization rules, subject to an exception for legitimate public purposes. Interesting thing is that Korea, which has not been in the CPTPP, has acceded to this agreement, and China has applied to accede. So I think China will see this as one stepping stone that it could get under its belt as part of the process of acceding to CPTPP. At the same time as this is happening, or a few months later, China does become a party to an agreement with an electronic commerce clause, and that's the RCEP agreement between the 7 Asian parties to the CPTPP plus Cambodia, China, Indonesia, and South Korea. And this includes the same 2 obligations, that you won't restrict international movement of data and you won't have data localization clauses, but the exceptions are drawn much more broadly. Have a careful look at this exception. The articles will not prevent parties from adopting any measure inconsistent with paragraph 2 that it considers necessary. So it's self-judgment to achieve a legitimate public policy objective, provided that the measure is not applied in a manner which blah blah. And the second exception is an explicit essential security interest exception, any measure that it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. And they even state explicitly that we're not going to have dispute settlement on this issue. Such measures shall not be disputed by other parties. So China was able to join that and feel that it could safely comply with that agreement or not be in breach of that agreement, even if it has lots of restrictions based on national security. So then the further development of cyber law in China. There was in addition to the earlier Cyber Security Act in 2017, in 2021, they adopted the Data Security Law, and then a Personal Information Protection Law, and then a series of more specific regulations issued by the Cyberspace Administration. So first look at the Data Security Law. Whereas the Cyber Security Law applied only to critical information operators, the Data Security Law applies to all data processors of any data, any information that's recorded electronically. There's an article allocating the responsibilities to particular ministries. There's articles obliging all data processors to fulfil data protection obligations, including not endangering national security and public interests, nor harming lawful rights of individuals. And then an article saying that the state should establish a categorised and classified system based on the importance of data. So you can kind of have level 1 data that's not so important, but level 2 it's a bit more important to protect. And as you get to a higher and higher number, then the national security objective kind of takes over and means you have a greater justification for not allowing the movement of that data. In addition, under that law, Article 30 obliges data processors to conduct risk assessments of their data processing on a regular basis and to file assessment reports with relevant departments. Article 31 says that the provisions of the cyber security law apply to important data by information infrastructure operators. And then it says that measures for outbound security management of important data collected or produced by other data processors shall be formulated by the cyberspace authorities, which they have been doing bit by bit. There are significant penalties, and they have introduced subsequent regulations of the cybersecurity information to define what they mean by important data and other aspects of these rules. Then you had the Personal Information Protection Law a few months later. This is the first comprehensive privacy law in China. So it includes provisions about limiting the amount of collection of personal information that you do, and explaining to people how you're collecting their information, taking measures to ensure the security of the information, and only storing it for as long as you need to store it. On data localization, the PIPO law does require personal information collected and generated in China to be stored in China. And it only allows for providing information to parties outside China, subject to a security assessment organised by the National Cyberspace Department. On generally cross-border transfer of personal data outside of China, it's permitted only if it meets quite a large number of requirements. You have to have had consent from the individual. There must be a legitimate predefined purpose. The transferor must ensure that the recipient country provides an adequate level of protection. And as I said before, adequate level of protection under the Chinese law focuses on protection of national security, in contrast to the EU, where it's all concerned about protection of privacy. And there is a backup: if the destination country does not provide an adequate level of protection, then the data exporter must conduct a security assessment, and the Chinese authorities may require additional security reviews, and the data exporters and the data importers could enter into contractual arrangements using standard approved contractual clauses about the obligations to ensure that data is protected to the same standard as it would be in China. Then the WTO joint text came out, which was completely silent on these rules. So you can see the parties are a little bit all over the place in the types of rules that they've adopted and in the types of treaty provisions that they're prepared to sign on to. What you can see is that China's rules are a little bit harder to comply with than other countries generally. And I just make two observations. Maybe people here can think of other possible consequences, but one observation is that there would have to be at least some foreign investors who are thinking about whether they're going to build a new business branch in another country would hesitate to put that branch in China rather than somewhere else because of the onerous obligations that they would have to carry out if they decide to place the business in China. If you've got a business that's already sort of got enormous sunk costs in China, I guess you'll just have to suck it up and comply with the law. The other thing is there's a lot of labelling requirements. There's like the EU illegal deforestation laws. There's Australian laws about keeping out cows that might be prone to mad cow disease. There's a lot of rules these days that require traceability of the product because you've got some kind of labelling requirement that's based on the production or process method by which the product was made. And if China won't let the data move from China outside the country, then it will mean that it's impossible for those products exported by China to satisfy the traceability to prove that it was made in the required method. And so they're not going to be able to take advantage of the favourable labelling requirements at the other end when it's presented to the consumer. That's just two consequences I can think of having a data regime that's a bit tighter than the rest of the world, but there may be others. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. The legal dimension to this kind of the flow of information and data across the border. And also in the setting of the Regional Economic Cooperation, RCP and the CPTPP, and there's a few sub-countries, 3 countries arrangement. So as a step towards some kind of a convergence, hopefully later on, about those the rules. Thank you so much. Yeah. John, please.
Thank you. So thanks very much indeed for inviting me to participate in this update. What I want to do today is put up an update for an update. That is, this issue of export denials is one I found interesting. First, about 3 years ago, I read something for Lowy, and then I participated in one of these updates in 2023. The big issue then was, well, what's going to happen? Today, 2 years on, we've got an opportunity to reflect on what has happened. But first of all, I want to just take you back to the backstory of the US denials of chips. And an important point is that it was not entirely a new policy. That is, for decades, the US and its allies have denied China access to the latest generation of semiconductors. The first Trump administration went a bit further, introducing controls on the export to China of advanced chip manufacturing equipment from ASML in the Netherlands, with the agreement of the Netherlands. And then the incoming Biden administration in 2022 extended the export denials to the export to China of advanced chips and chip making equipment. As Jake Sullivan, the then National Security Advisor, described it, it was a small yard, high fence. The objective here was explicitly anyway, in background briefings, and portrayed as such by Beast by Greg Allen of SICE. The objective was to stall and then, if possible, reverse China's progress with artificial intelligence and its applications. The key thing about the export denial in 2022 was that, in contrast to the previous practice of permitting exports of chips 2 or 3 years on to China, that the US would freeze the export of chips to the state of play reached in 2022, which was broadly described as 7 nanometer chip, which would be denied to China. And since it wouldn't get any more advanced chips, the ones it had would fall further and further behind the frontier of US development. And that would be fatal not just to artificial intelligence, but indeed to any application in China that require advanced chips, were this policy to be as successful as intended. And at the same time, so far as it was possible to do so, the US would um, um, ban the servicing of existing fabricating machines in China, so that it's costly to even maintain what it had to degrade over time. The second Trump administration this year confirmed the Biden administration measures and added some new ones. It began by denying the H20 chip from NVIDIA, which was designed to meet the Biden US rules, a chip of lesser performance than the most advanced NVIDIA chip, but deemed acceptable to export to China in the Biden administration, then banned by Trump. Interestingly, it appears to have been released in as a result of an agreement between China and the US in July of this year, and the US and NVIDIA are now processing export orders for the H20 chip to China. And the Trump administration tightened up a few other rules, mainly on supercomputer technologies. Strangely, there are reports in recent days that it's considering permitting export to China of the NVIDIA H200, which is a much more advanced chip than the H20, possibly under pressure from NVIDIA and the rest of the tech community. Well, why are we talking about this at all in the context of digitization in China? When, after all, the huge amount of digitization that has already occurred in China has occurred long before these advanced chips were available, or before AI models were available. And the reason is that the next leg of digitization in China, and indeed everywhere else, will involve artificial intelligence, particularly for predictive analysis, personalisation, improved decision making, and so forth, and is increasingly critical to the future of the whole digitisation project. And were the US to be successful, this would prevent China from moving very much further with digitisation. Well, let's think about what's happened over the last 3 years. The US embarked on a very, very big experiment designed to prevent China moving ahead in AI or other processes involving advanced chips. China has been able to work around, in the first instance, work around some of these denials. One way was for Huawei to develop a chip of lesser capability than the most advanced NVIDIA chips. For example, current Ascend chip delivers only about a third of the performance of an NVIDIA processor, but the Huawei system uses 5 times as many chips and achieves something of the same performance as NVIDIA's equivalent. China also stockpiled chips in advance of bans. It's moved to greater use of data centers as opposed to in-house systems to economise the use of systems, and particularly for small to medium enterprises. And according to reports, China has also successfully covertly imported some quantities of chips. But at the same time, and much more importantly, China has been moving ahead with chip design and manufacture. Huawei's now producing in volume the Ascend series of chips, which matches for some applications the H20, which was denied until the middle of this year. And it's announced more advanced chips for 2026, 2028. And this raises the issue, although in the US assessment, these chips are not going to be as good as the comparable NVIDIA chips. Are they going to be good enough for the purposes for which China requires AI or advanced chip processors? We'll come back to that in a moment. And the US has officially acknowledged that China has, through Huawei, has moved ahead in advanced chips, that it's these new chips are at least the capacity of the denied 7 nanometer chip that originally inspired the Biden administration ban. And in the view of the US, Huawei will only be able to produce about 200,000 this year. Huawei has responded that it'll be producing a great many more next year. The big shock, of course, 2 years ago was the announcement of the of China's DeepSeek large language model, which US policy was designed to prevent China acquiring. And it's true that actually that DeepSeek, the first DeepSeek, was trained on NVIDIA chips. So it didn't settle the issue of whether China could proceed down the route of artificial intelligence without American chips. It now appears that the subsequent iterations of DeepSeek are using locally made chips for training and inference. While it's certainly the case that NVIDIA chips remain well in front of China chips, and that the gap actually may grow over the next year or two, it's evident that Huawei's most recent chips are sufficient to run DeepSeek and many other applications for which China has given priority. China now appears to have around about 1,500 publicly released large language models and perhaps 3,000 models in all. There's a lot of excitement in the US trade media about China and answers. I'd summarise the state of play this way. US businesses, NVIDIA in particular, have moved to well beyond the 7 nanometer node, at which China is now producing the bulk of its chips. But it's said to be 1 to 2 years behind the US producers, and it's able to match the US compute by using less capable chips with more of them. Said to be less efficient, more expensive, but who cares? It's also said to be the case, it's a separate issue, that China businesses are working around the barrier raised by the US ban, joined by the Netherlands, on the supply of new advanced chip making. Well, SAIS 3 years ago was very cheerful about the US bans, expected them to be successful. In its most recent commentary, it acknowledges that the imposition of export controls has resulted in China doubling down on its existing deeply subsidised development efforts and raised the possibility that China's current work in its universities could produce breakthrough technologies that are capable of leapfrogging the current state of the art. Well, that's obviously very speculative, but a admission that from science that the 2022 measures don't seem to be working all that great. Eric Schmidt, Google's former CEO, said just last year that the US had a 2 to 3 year lead in artificial intelligence, which is, in his view, an alternative in the world in which he works. By the end of that year, he had conceded that China was closing the gap. In his view, shocking. And I thought the restrictions we placed on chips would keep them back permanently. Not so much. Well, should we be astonished by this? Maybe not. The US is spending a bit more on R&D, but China's pretty close behind. Certainly in AI research, the US and China are pretty well equivalent. And although China's a smaller economy, its manufacturing sector is twice as big. We also shouldn't be surprised because, after all, the intent of US policy in 2022 posed an existential threat to the China economy, to which it had to respond in the biggest possible way, and did. I was interested to read a piece in New York Times by researchers from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, not an institute that's called kind to China's aspirations. Last month, China's already surpassing the United States in science and technology research. And of 64 critical technologies, China takes the #1 spot globally in 57 of those fields, according to research by ASPI. Well, a few concluding thoughts. It's not the first time this happened. It's happened with nuclear weapons, with intercontinental ballistic missile, satellite technology, and so forth. China has demonstrated a capability to acquire what it needs. So the defeat of the 2022 denials, if it is the case, is not issuing in a new era in world affairs, but it's a repetition of what we've said earlier. I think it encourages us to think about the different attainments of the US and China in AI and chip technology in a different way, perhaps less as a race than as the development of tools that are suitable for their economies and their national purposes. It's difficult to frame it as a race because, after all, there's no winning post, there's no end to this, there's no goal. And in the end, they're going to have different purposes. China's predominantly a manufacturing economy with much bigger agriculture sector than the US. Serves somewhat smaller. That suggests to us how AI is going to be, via digitalisation, is going to be effective within those economies. a point that was made in the story in the Wall Street Journal a day or two ago. The US might want to use AI to cure cancer, or AI robots will eliminate poverty. China, according to the story, is focusing on something more, like how to use AI to make better washing machines. Final thought. In the world of affairs, this was an empirical test on an absolutely stupendously grand scale. Testable proposition in 2022 is that the US could control China's technological path, and in this instance by arresting or delaying AI development in China. Well, we can't be conclusive about it at this point, but the attempt has failed, probably. That the US proponents of the ban are now talking about it in a different way. They're not talking about it as preventing China's development of AI, preventing China from acquiring advanced chips, but of preserving a need for NVIDIA, an entirely different issue, and one that's, whether successful or not, is another great moment for the rest of the world. For China, the consequences of the 2022 decision, some delay, some increased cost, but anyway, China, we know, was seeking indigenous independence in chip making. It's achieved. It's working towards it rather more rapidly as a result of the US ban. But US providers, some lost revenue for NVIDIA. It's a real risk that the US policymakers have accelerated the creation of alternative technosphere in China, which might pose a competitive problem a decade hence. Otherwise, I think no great problem for the US, but a great and interesting episode. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The geopolitical consideration will continue to play out. The impact on the dark development. China will the United States, perhaps also with the rest of the world. So let's move to the third speaker, Raghuvir.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Dr. Riksha, madam, and Dr. Ligang. So I will be talking about the export efficiency and the recent trends. China's digitalization. This is jointly co-authored with Professor Jiang Fang from the University and Professor Kantiajan from Australian National. So, to introduce the importance of digitalization was made in China 2025 plan to make China's manufacturing into more technologically advanced products, and digitalization was introduced in this plan to play a vital role in increasing their exports. But I have taken this concept of efficiency into this because the export should be efficient enough to adapt to digitalization. So, just an overview of Made in China 2025 plan across 10 key sectors, including electrical, energy vehicles, the BYD, new materials, medical devices. So, in the context, yes, it was announced in 2015 and it has a very modest rise by almost 3%. But comparatively, China has been increasing its merchandising high-tech exports comparatively, but the growth is very less. So China has improved world rankings, and to prove China's technological advancement and the self-sufficient digitalization, the new foreign investment law of 2020 has actually removed the laws of technology transfer. It shows China's indigenous growth. But if we look at the services sector or the information technology sector, which is very crucial in digitalization, China is currently running a deficit as well as a deficit in the MIC sectors as well. Nevertheless, China is still the leading exporter of merchandise. So the efficiency will be run on the merchandise commodities exports overall. So now the concept of behind the border constraints, we know China's domestic constraints, but there are some beyond the border constraints as well. So which will be coming in the next slides. So now the interesting policy question is whether China has achieved the export efficiency in its current trade. So export efficiency is the ratio of the actual exports which China is doing divided by the potential exports which China should have been given its domestic resources and technological advancements. So just a common literature review, TFP is better in manufacturing, yes, proved. The issue of tariffs, yes, since 2016, Trump comes and just shift the tariffs. Then the NTBs are increasing instead of tariffs. China is very successful in trade diversification, as mentioned in the earlier sessions. The output FDI of China is increasing, which is one of the most important role in increasing its export efficiency. And the strong domestic market of China actually shows its success of digitalization within China. So these are just figures. Figures talk more than words. So the export efficiency is increasing. The import FDI is also going down a bit, but in the services sector. So we take a stochastic frontier gravity model using the Poisson-Sivio annual estimates. It was developed by Professor Raghuvir. So Xij, very straightforward. The vector B represents the parameters to be estimated unknown to the model. So we will be putting that in the model. And the variance of the error term has a zero. The term of UI captures the impact of the behind the border constraints. And it should be having a value from 0 to 1. So if it is more towards 1, it means that there are some domestic constraints which are including China's total exports. And it has a truncated normal distribution and the value of mean. The term eta in the model, if it is positive, it means that the gap between the actual exports and the potential exports is decreasing. If it's 0, which is practically impossible, but it will be consistent, and if it's negative, it means the gap is increasing. So the export efficiency, non-actual exports divided by non-potential exports. So this is the equation. I just took NBS, WITS because these are some of the trusted sources. And panel data set is from 1995 to 2021 because since 2022 there are a lot of policy implications which are not in place or which are not yet observed. So I will be talking that. So when we run the equation, one of the interesting things over here is that the distance has a positive measure. So it shows that the more the distance between China and its exporting partners, the trade should increase. Now this is very interesting. It shows China's digitalization aims and the infrastructure through which China can actually increase its exports even to the farthest corner of the world. Surprisingly, China per capita GDP missed its statistical significance by a very small value, but it's as it is. The gamma is coming close to 1, it means that this model is robust for the panel data set. The mu value has some statistical significance and the eta is positive and statistically significant. It means that the export efficiency is increasing over years. So let's see whether is the case. Yeah. So if we see from 1995 to 2021, it has increased by 5%. And this is very interesting because if we see the years of crisis, 2007 and 2021, China has actually increased its efficiency. It shows that Chinese systems are very robust in its trade and in its manufacturing. Yes, it has an upward trend. But if we see by the countries over the years, now this is very important because if we see the developed countries of Europe and the developing countries, with developing countries, China has a greater export efficiency. But with the developed countries, it has a lower export efficiency. Now, these developed countries want more digitalized, high-end manufactured products, which China needs to develop more. So over here, there are top 10 export and import countries. If we see the gap between China and US, it's huge. Though China has acquired the second position, but 605 and 158 is a huge gap. Yeah, and if we see the percentage of cross-border e-commerce, like the exports through e-commerce, China's share is very less. Domestically, yes, domestically China is very robust. I used to buy everything from Pinduoduo, right? From my pencil to my food to my groceries, everything. But cross-border, very different. So when we see the behind the border, we have identified infrastructure, ease of shipments and logistics, and they have regressed it on the average efficiency of each year of China. And it shows positive results. These figures are taken from LPI index of World Bank. So China should be working on these three things. So the policy and conclusion of the export efficiency is that yes, China's average export efficiency is 85%. However, China shows a low efficiency with the developed nations because they want very sophisticated products. So it has a lot of potential to export technology to the upgraded manufactured with e-commerce prospects. But having said that, so HWS again, China should give FESCO some contracts as well. So over here, if we see the made in China sold on Amazon all across the world, and China leading the global e-commerce market through made in China, these figures are almost same, so it is consistent. However, the key challenges in the recent trends have made it more difficult. Now, the currency payments, most of the people, I don't think, are very comfortable to pay in Chinese yuan. So that is one of the main things. Now, the trust in these apps, Temu versus Pinduoduo. Personally, I don't trust Temu because of the drastically lower costs. But Pinduoduo has lower costs than Temu itself. So, do we trust these apps, these digitalization apps? Then it's DEPA. DEPA has the earlier figure said, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. China has been doing it since the negotiations are on since November 2021. 4 years down the line, there is no consensus. Also, the CPTPP, there is still no consensus whether we should include China in the CPTPP or not. Now, that actually dents the digital exports potential of China over here. Yeah, and of course the Trump factor. Today he says something, then he says something, then he pauses, then he says again. So the stability of this governance is impacting the Chinese digitalization policy in many countries. Then the cyber security crackdown. Now this is very important with the privacy issue that's because in 2021 to 2022 there has been a crackdown on many Asian companies on cyber security. So coupled that with privacy in Western countries, in many countries where China wants to have its penetration through digital trade, we are very sensitive about our privacy. This classroom doesn't have cameras because it's a private thing, but in China, each and every classroom has cameras. So, the privacy things in China is different, and in other countries is different. And Alipay and WeChat compatibility in international markets. Now, if we see in Thailand, Thailand has more than 90% export efficiency. In Thailand, some counters accept Alipay and WeChat, at least Alipay. But in many countries, Alipay is functional, but people are not very comfortable to use Alipay in Western countries. So if we see the top 10 countries ranked by retail e-commerce, China, very healthy rate. However, the sales growth rate, China is not in the top 10. So the growth has been very low of China in digitalization. So I have made this picture really well because I did not like the growth rate of China coming down in its e-commerce exports from 2014 to 2024. It is less than 5%. This is not a good trend for China's digitalization targets. And if we see China's e-commerce growth projected till 2025, it is 15%. And if we see the US alone, it's more than 50%. So where is China going wrong over here? China has made policies. China has made really nice digitalization plans. It is negotiating in DEPA and CPTPP, but the growth rate is really less. That means that the gap between its actual exports of through digitalization and the potential exports which it should be exporting is increasing. And that brings down the export efficiency of China. So if you're not efficient enough, then it's in the long run, there is no confidence in the investment, as we see in the FDI, which is dropping in manufacturing. That's the presentation. Thank you so much.
We should have a time to have a few questions. Yeah, Greg. Paris.
Is it possible to imagine one of the unintended consequences of the US to China? These two are more, these two are accelerated and even sort of more urgent to kind of catching up within China. So basically, thanks to China, but on this path, assuming it's independence even sooner than it has otherwise achieved. And the related question is this race between China and the US really a binary or in a sense it's like a linear kind of ranking? But is it really like that? Is it possible if we think that China's advantages in this huge population, which has been digitally connected, so you have data scale of data kind of an advantage in China. And then in the US, you still have the leading position in terms of innovation, the ecosystem of innovation. So it seems like is it possible in your opinion that the race actually leads with two countries onto a different path for AI development? Yeah, just in your opinion.
Yes, well, I think that's sorry. I think that's quite correct that China has absolutely no choice but to develop as quickly as it possibly can an alternative to the chips that are denied, and at the same time work as quickly as it can, and it's not at all clear whether and where it will succeed, but to replace ASLM with an indigenous producer of chip fabricators. A much more difficult task, probably, than producing the chips at the level that it's using. So I think it highly likely will produce over time if the US maintains its constraints, and it's possible that the Trump administration should have to turn this. That is possible. It's quite possible that China will evolve a separate technology that will be available for export to the rest of the world in competing with the US providers. And that will turn out to be the major consequence of the 22 denials. And I think otherwise you're also right, that is that they're in many respects quite comparable, the US and China, in the vastness of their data pools, in the quantity of their data centers and plans to build many more. The US is probably quite a bit ahead in terms of the capability of its AI models, but not that far ahead. And it seems to be ahead in compute, that is, in total capacity relevant to AI. But in other respects, they're very similar. As you say, China has some advantages in data. It has some advantages in having so quickly digitized the rest of the economy in a way that, in our experience, both countries has placed the US from a consumer point. So I think it's quite likely. But I think as time goes on, we'll think of it less as a race, and China's going there, and the US is going there, and I'd be interested in watch. Thank you.
If you have a question,
Thank you. I have a question for Frank, and then a question for Peter. I was wondering, following on Sherry's question, if US and China developing two separate systems, then based on your survey of what's going on at the moment, which you think of other countries, what are their thoughts on these developments in the field of digital transformation in China, and what's the other many countries outside US and China thinking and what are strategies at the moment? That's the question for me. And the other question for Brad is, I missed the earlier part of the presentation, but at the end, I got a message that China's law probably was too high to attract investment, and that reminds me of the discussion in environmental laws, where there's crucial hypothesis that countries lower their standards to investment. But in this context, do you think China should lose this law, or it's kind of live? Is it justified? If
First, there are two models we think there is. It's how third countries are affected by the emergence of two hemispheres. One model might be, well, we just go ahead and we utilise whatever we can to the best of product from either provider. And that would accord, for example, with Australia's attitude to electric vehicles produced in China. That is, almost all electric vehicles are now produced in China. And we will probably vastly accelerate our import of China electric vehicles over the next decade, and they'll constitute a very large part of our fleet. The complication, of course, with technology is some of the issues that Brett was raising about data transfer and security implications of that were evident in our refusal to allow Huawei to run the 5G system in Australia. So those issues are going to be present, but there are lots of issues where that security issue is not raised. And I don't see any reason why Australia, if it can contain that particular issue, won't be able to quite freely choose what we use those products that are.
In fact,
Yeah, your question was do I think that China should reduce the stringency of its data requirements in order to attract investment? I think the question there more fundamentally that. I mean, I think that the problem with the concept of national security in China is it's not really about the security of China, it's about the security of the tenure of the Chinese Communist Party in China. And so the concept of the Chinese government about what sort of things are essentially based on that. And that's probably not something that's going to radically change very quickly. I think that it would. I think that in any case, China is going to make efforts as much as it can to make its rules work as effectively as it can, to make all the negotiations with its security departments and with other companies work as best they can in order to get the security clearance.
Thank you so much. I think we should move on, and please join me in thanking our speakers for their contribution.
Well, we're coming to the end of a long, very interesting